if you listen to them, literally the guy just said that we're going to be Cisco because we have quantum networking and they have old networking. So we're going to take Cisco's market cap. And if you compare that to our current stock price, we're 20x bigger. So we're going to be a 20 bagger. My jaw dropped listening to that. But in any event, I encourage everybody to try to use a quantum computer. If you know any Python, you can run a quantum computer, which is really cool. The first quantum computer programs that you can run that are like reasonable and interesting are only like 10, 15 lines of code. And you can ask ChatGPT to break down each line of code. The last time I tried it with ChatGPT, it didn't work great because the programming language, which is Python, and the package, which is called qiskit, is IBM's package, which is very popular across the quantum industry, and ionq uses it as well. Qiskit has gone through a lot of changes as IBM has kind of fumbled it quite a bit. So there's a lot of versions of Qiskit, and you're going to run into these situations where ChatGPT tells you to write a certain line of code, and the compiler will tell you, no, that's been deprecated or it doesn't work that way. And you'll have to sort of go through it. But if you want, you can also go to my GitHub. I've posted a bunch of scripts that run on IBM's quantum computers, and it won't take you more than an afternoon to see that there's nothing here. That the best these quantum computers, quote unquote, can do is factor a number like 65,411. It's really great at that. But if you add an extra number to that, they will fail. And if you try to multiply two large numbers in a quantum computer, that won't work either. They can't crop a photo, right? These aren't computers that do things like that. Somebody mentioned in my chat that, well, Nvidia can't do those things either. And that's not true. Nvidia's computers are general purpose computers. You can do almost anything on an Nvidia. You can run an operating system on a GPU as well. They're optimized to do parallel processing of large data streams. And that's why they're useful for AI. When I hear people say quantum AI, I really have to laugh, because if you've ever run, say, PyTorch or any program in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence at all, you know that there's absolutely no use. So when you run a neural network, you have to keep it in memory. And keeping it in memory, these neural networks are usually tens of gigabytes or more. There's only a couple hundred qubits on the best quantum computers. ionq is unfortunately only 30 or 40 qubits, which is pathetic. But in 30 or 40 qubits, maybe I could write your name, maybe your social security number. I think you'd run out of space by then, actually. Your full name might fit on an ionq computer. Maybe. The goal is that, they have new acquisitions coming up. Those acquisitions will make this work. They're going to add this technology and that technology. By the end of it, it's going to be an amazing thing. Again, the problem isn't that technology won't advance. Of course it will. The problem is that building a computer out of wood is possible. Alan Turing did it. You can build a computer out of steel. You can build a computer out of anything that has a gate. But you don't want to do that because we have really fast gates. And even on a theoretical basis, nobody has ever claimed that a quantum computer will have faster gates or faster processing speed in any way than a traditional computer. The reason scientists like quantum computing is the complexity class shift. Complexity makes even the most hardened scientists' eyes spin. It's not a fun subject. Once you start talking about p space, does p equal np, bounded quantum polynomial time, it's enough to make your head spin. And Scott Aronson's wonderful book, Quantum Computing Since Democritus, is an attempt to introduce this relatively easily, but it's a really hard book to read. And if you try to go through Sipser's book, which is, as I mentioned, my wife worked with him at MIT. It's not that easy either, and there's a reason this stuff's really hard. It's easier to believe, quantum computing, that's a faster Nvidia, right? You're neglecting, reality. And reality is the only thing that scientists care about quantum computing is the complexity shift that you can go from one class to the next. You can shift from polynomial time, from exponential time. You've completely enabled a new problem. If you've ever done any computer science, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, it's really hard to explain. And that's why, again, I encourage you to watch a video or two on complexity, and you'll gather the idea that some problems are harder than others. If you map like the millions of potential problems there are a few of those problems. And in fact, unfortunately, there's just one. where quantum can do it faster. And that problem is factoring integers. Clock speed is, 5 gigahertz. It's got millions of threads of work that it can do. How do you beat that? Nobody's claiming that's going to happen. But I think when the guy just does a call and just talks about Nvidia the whole call, instead of talking about his own company, talking to people in the quantum industry, they're in it for the science. Nobody wants to do this for commercial glory. Nobody thinks there's a commercial opportunity. Drug discovery is a funny space. I happen to know a little bit about it. Most of drug discovery's bottleneck is in clinical trials. You have to get people to give a drug. It's really painful. It takes years. You have to get doctors and nurses to sign up to do a really tedious and laborious job. That's the hard part about drug discovery. It's very easy, once you know the drug target, to make a drug. In fact, there's no open problems there. Every chemist on the planet knows how to make a drug once he has a crystal structure, he or she has a crystal structure, some assays, etc. The idea that we need a quantum computer to help us is a little bit disingenuous, to say the least.
A lot of people will argue that technology is, it was one of those exponential things. The amount of time that we went from, using the discovery and using the wheel to, flying planes and then, going from, prop to jet, it's all exponential.
Yep.
So one of the biggest arguments I'm hearing is that this is going to be one of those exponential jumps that's going to happen a lot sooner than we think. What do you think, what would you say to those people that think that we can make that leap a lot quicker or sooner than you anticipate,
It's a lot. There's probably a good fallacy. There's some fallacy website where debate nerds go on and name the fallacy. I don't know that stuff. I don't know what the difference between steel man and straw man is. I don't.
Slippery slope.
Exactly. Yeah. I call this the menu problem. The waiter gives you a menu of things, and you assume that's the only list of things that there is. So you look at the menu and say, see quantum computing, and you say, wow, that's the future. That's going to grow and become the next big thing. There's CPUs, then there are GPUs, now there's going to be quantum. And the problem is you're not seeing the whole menu. Why don't you think DNA computing is going to be bigger than quantum computing? Why don't you think optical computing is going to be bigger? Why don't you think thermodynamic computing is going to be bigger? Why don't you think Nvidia is going to not figure out the next big thing? Because they are working on it. You see the quantum computing stocks and you basically want to gamble. That's the reason. You retro-causally decide that quantum's the future when there's lots of people working on different kinds of compute that are honestly more promising and a lot more open-ended than quantum, which is, again, most scientists agree is a Shor solver. You're investing in a Shor solver. If you can show me another problem that has a true speed up over classical, like I said, that's a Nobel Prize. Nobody can really point to one. Shor's is the place where you can get the massive win that people are talking about. They take that and conflate it to other things. If you look at biotech, space I know pretty well, gene therapy has been around since the 80s, and it always promises to be this precision win where you can install a new gene that a dying person is missing. I had a friend die of cystic fibrosis. I've had friends die of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's such a great promise, but it doesn't work. It's the only problem. It looks great on a television screen. It looks great on an investor newsletter. It looks great on a pitch from some guy that doesn't know what he's talking about. It sounds fantastic. The virus goes in, delivers the gene that you're missing, boom, you're saved. Unfortunately, technology is hard to actually make work. In this case, there's immunogenicity, there's tissue tropism, there's the size of the payload. You have to learn it. It's a technical space. So if you just went into gene therapy saying, oh, it sounds great, awesome, instead of asking critical questions, you'd realize it's a space that has some promise, but largely has been really disappointing. CRISPR is the same way. CRISPR, there was so much success and excitement about CRISPR. Walter Isaacson wrote a book about Jennifer Doudna. It was such an amazing discovery, but what have we gotten out of CRISPR? Still not a single drug. Stock market prices of the stocks involved in CRISPR have plummeted. You would have been a fool to rush and go buy CRISPR stocks when the CRISPR announcements were happening. That's when the CRISPR stocks peaked. So consider that, the lay excitement about something is often the peak of the real thing. And we ask scientists at Pfizer or Merck, is CRISPR really going to change medicine? And they sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, there are a lot of technical problems. CRISPR can't get to tissues. It's extracellular in general. It's a huge machinery. It can't really swim into cells. You probably have to pack it into a gene therapy. Now we're back to the gene therapy problems. There's a reason drug companies haven't gone all in on CRISPR. It might be 20 or 30 years before we figure out how to harness CRISPR. I hope this is sinking in, because it's the same thing with quantum, of course. It may be 20 or 30 years, and 20 or 30 years ago was 20 or 30 years. We just keep finding new problems that get in our way. So the surface error, the surface code error correction scheme by Google started this whole rally. IBM is now saying that they have a better surface code, and they're calling it the gross code or something like that. And that looked really interesting. But again, they actually have to do it. And you might say, well, Martin, by the time they do it, they'll have solved the problem. That's right. If they can actually do it and implement it and scale it, they'll have solved the problem, and we can be able to factor Shors. And I will take all Satoshi's Bitcoin. It's going to be great. But nobody else is going to buy a quantum computer to hack Shors. So I think that it's a very weird space if you understand it. And if you want to close your eyes and sort of just pretend you understand it, it can be very exciting. But I'd rather live in reality.
Is there a way to store like short-term memory? Like with a regular computer, you need the RAM, but with quantum, there's no such thing. So it's kind of what you get is what you get.
Yeah, that's why it's useful for specific problems where it's like, what variable? Like, imagine setting up a problem like a linear combination, and you say, I've got 10 variables, and I want a desired output. What are the coefficients of these linear combinations? Now, unfortunately, that's really easy to solve on an actual regular old computer. We solved that problem a long time ago. But if you imagine a quantum computer, it sort of works like that. You'd say, my outcome is maximal profit. I have 600 stocks. What is the weight that I need to apply to each stock? And the quantum computer does its magic and figures out the answer in a blink of an eye when any old other computer could never do it. Sounds exciting. The problems where it can do that right now are limited to like literally just Shors, which is a cryptographic problem that has been solved and has moved on. We're pretty far away from a place where we can think about quantum being more broadly useful until you can shift complexity classes on new problems. You have Grovers, and you have what I call like new extensions of Grovers, which are largely still just Grovers, and they don't get you from exponential time to polynomial time. You're still in the exponential regime. You don't need a quadratic speedup in most problems. Most Monte Carlo problems or other optimization problems are solvable on a laptop. There's very few people that need bigger computers. Some people think that maybe weather forecasting, there are a couple of places where you do need to like manage billions of variables at once, and it's really hard for combinatorial explosion to keep those all on track. But even then, you're still suffering from the limitation of memory, quantum compute, where how are you actually going to update the circuit in real time? Quantum computers are one of these weird things where you have to set up the circuit. It's like an FPGA. You have to set up the circuit once. You can't like have a program that can easily you can easily close down or launch another program. It just doesn't work that way. The whole program has to be self-contained and run start to finish with no problems. And for that reason, there's not a lot of like flow control or not a lot of typical stuff in computing. You're really more just looking at cracking like one weird problem. Again, this could change.
What is your thoughts on ionq's recent acquisition on Oxford Ionics? Is it going to give them an edge in any way? And one thing I wanted to add is it possible to optimize current problems or even future problems into a method or into a way that a quantum computer can actually interpret and solve using its strengths?
Yeah, both good questions. I don't think ionq changes anything. I think they're getting a collection of smart people, no doubt about that, and that's great. But Quantinium seems to be in the lead on ion trap computers, and ionq has just done 6 acquisitions, which as a former publicly traded company CEO and a current privately traded CEO, I can tell you, doing acquisitions is one of the most distracting things in the world. it's not a lot of fun. The juice has to be worth the squeeze. Acquisitions can ruin companies because you have to integrate. You have to bring all the new people in. You have to see who's who, what's what. I certainly would never recommend doing more than one acquisition at a time, and I would condemn the idea of doing 6 at once because as just completely crazy. Imagine integrating 6 ERP systems, 6 procurement systems, the 6 HR people that have just joined you. You know, you have to do a lot of busy work for no reason. Some acquisitions take years to integrate. So I think it's kind of crazy to do 6 acquisitions and pay stock for each of them. If ionq has something valuable, why give it away? You know, if the company had something really valuable, then I wouldn't be printing my stock out like it was, you know, toilet paper. I'd be clutching it closely and saying, I'm going to treat these shares as preciously rare and valuable tools. Instead, you know, just printing the stock off like it's garbage, giving it to anybody who will take it. You know, I think that speaks volumes. And if that's true, just buying a couple $1 billion of stuff doesn't mean you're worth $10 or $12 billion of stuff. So I heard from one person who bid on one of their acquisitions that they paid double what they offered. And then I heard that the last raise for Oxford was 10 times lower in price, 10x lower. So to me, I think ionq is just trying to get rid of its stock while it's still in the 40s or 30s, because they know that there'll be a quantum winner again. When this stock was a single-digit stock, we'll be right back to that when there's no actual users or customers and people realize there's no organic growth and there's no organic revenue in the company. Maybe there will be a new shorts algorithm. Maybe it'll be in a problem set that's really important. But so far, you saw Jensen at his own conference inviting the ionq people up and other folks, and he said, you don't need a faster solution to traveling salesman. Traveling salesman is the quintessential NP hard problem, and we have great approximations for traveling salesman. So there's no real great way to solve traveling salesman perfectly, and even quantum computers don't pretend that they can do this. There's no complexity class change. This is the dream, is that you can take a problem that's not Shor's and Shorify it, solvable by a quantum computer. Trust me, I've tried this. You know, it is a really good idea, and it probably will bear fruit at some point. I think that it's not trivial, and people have taken this with Grover's, which is just a quadratic speed up. So that means that if a problem takes 100 steps, it can do the problem in 10 steps, which is a fast speed up. But if I give you a problem with 100 quadrillion steps, you haven't gotten much of a speed up. It's still intractable. So, and Grover's is not something that's easy to implement, and no one's really made a practical use of it yet. But Shor's is something that is really amazing. It turns an impossible problem to a 1-second solution. That is cool. To a computer scientist, that is kind of the coolest thing in the world. You know, you might do biology and you see a DNA replicate or something, you might say, wow, that's the coolest thing ever. Or CRISPR edit, excise and edit, or a base, flip a base pair or something like that. And you might think that's cool. To a computer science person, going from a problem that all the computers in the universe combined, squared, could not address in 1 billion years, to a problem where you just press a button and it's done, that's really, really neat. But the problem is really boring. And so can we take a cool problem and put it into this form and get an answer? The problem is, again, I want you to take a step back and think about computers in general. There are no problems we have in computing today that are bound by computational complexity. The problems we have in computing today at XAI and OpenAI and others is gathering the world's information, siphoning it into a distillable format, and putting it into a neural network where the neural network is adjusting each weight and each bias of 100 billion neurons. Now, the problem with that is that we would need 100 billion qubits, and we struggle to make 100 qubits or 1,000 qubits. Decoherence means that these computers can't even stay entangled for a second, so the program has to run really quickly. But the problem is, if you're training a neural network, you've got to shove all this data from the disk to RAM to VRAM in the case of GPUs, and recycle it and spread it across a whole network. You can't do that with a quantum computer. Like, I don't think there's anybody in quantum computing that thinks, honestly, that will ever do that. Because, as Jensen said, and if you want to learn more about this, I would watch the Jensen interview at GTC, where he had the 10 quantum computing CEOs up for half an hour. He brought another 10 up, and then he brought another 10 up. It's partially a roast where he's just sort of making fun of them, but he's also asking questions and learning the same way we are. And I think if you watch that, you'll get a really good understanding of what quantum is and what it isn't. And I think that nobody in their right mind thinks that quantum is some like solution for, you know, all computing problems. And it's certainly not a solution for a large data problem like AI. And I think people see the AI boom and they say, I want to get in on something like this. But quantum is not that. Quantum is for scientists, people who want to do stuff with really big numbers, like 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, traveling salesman. Traveling salesman is a funny one. So traveling salesman is easy to understand. There's a salesman, a door-to-door salesman, who has to make 100 stops. What order is the fastest order for the salesman? This turns out to be a really, really complicated problem because of exponential calculation. If there's 100 stops, that means you're raising to the power of 100. If you take any number and raise it to the power of 100, it's enormous. And if you had to calculate each path, it's like the brackets in NCAA. Buffett said, if you get it right, I'm giving you $1 billion or $1 million. Nobody's ever gotten it right. Why? Well, you're raising 2, because it's a binary event. Team A wins or team B wins. So you're raising it to 2 to the 32nd power just for the first round. Then there's a couple more rounds. It's like 2 to the 64th power. Your chances of winning that are not computationally like even explainable. They're not even like the lotto. The lotto is, it's like winning the lotto every day for the rest of your life. It's impossible. And so traveling salesman turns out to be this really tough problem to get exactly right. But the funny thing is, if you know your city, I know New York City, and Harlem's at the top of New York City, and the World Trade Center is at the bottom of New York City. And maybe there's 100 stops in my traveling salesman problem. But I know that I'm not going to go from the World Trade Center to Harlem and back. I know, generally speaking, kind of what's going to be a good solution. And in computer science, we want maybe the perfect solution because we're curious. But FedEx doesn't do any business with ionq or D-Wave or any of these companies. People that have a lot of packages and a lot, like airplanes or even worse, scheduling airplanes. They don't do any business with quantum. These guys need it the most. Optimization is critical for these guys, but they can do it on a computer. They don't need high compute. So like, there's just nothing here that's really exciting. As a scientist, it's the coolest, funnest stuff in the world, and it's some of the most complex stuff in the world.